Bowling Green Plantation, Wilkinson County, Mississippi, 1795. Lala, a slave woman, hasn't seen her husband all day. Worried, she quietly looks for him until she hears a noise coming from a nearby barn. She finds her husband Jimmy dripping in sweat, hard at work on a large machine. He says their master wants another cotton gin, and that another machine will help make things easier for the other slaves. More cotton gins, he explains, meant white folks might even eventually free their slaves. At this, Lala admits she can't fathom how this was going to help free them. If more machines could process more cotton per day, wouldn't the white people just want more cotton picked? Jimmy dismisses his wife's concerns and rushes her out of the barn, and she goes to bed alone. But sleep doesn't come, because her gut tells her that her husband is wrong. This episode of Extra History is brought to you by all of our wonderful patrons over on Patreon. Thanks so much for your support. The cotton gin is a landmark in American technology, an invention that shows the promise of innovation and how that promise can go unfulfilled. A lesson that's quite relevant today. Because when it first appeared, some enslaved people thought the cotton gin would make their lives easier by removing the arduous task of removing cotton seeds by hand. Some even said that the device could pave the road to abolish slavery. And one person who reportedly believed that was the machine's inventor, Eli Whitney. Though ironically, his machine had the opposite effect. Born in Westborough, Massachusetts in 1765, Whitney exhibited talents for many things in his teens, including blacksmithing and manufacturing. In fact, he was talented in so many areas that he had a hard time figuring out what he wanted to do in life. So with his goals still scattered, he decided to attend Yale and parlay his degree into a teaching position. Then, freshly graduated, he traveled to Georgia based on a job offer. But the promised employment fell through. Now alone, stranded, and unemployed, he had to make some new connections. But luckily for Whitney, a plantation owner by the name of Catherine Green took a shine to him, offering him housing and introducing him to her manager, Phineas Miller. They all became fast friends, and in 1793, the three of them played integral roles in the creation of a revolutionary machine, the cotton gin. Now some say Green actually came up with the design and Whitney just built it for her and operated as its frontman because, sexism. While others claim Green simply provided Whitney with funding and resources. But to understand why the cotton gin was such a game changer, you need to know a few things about cotton and how it was produced. You see, African Americans working on a cotton plantation were responsible for growing and picking cotton. Work, we should add, that they did in the oppressive heat, while subjected to physical and verbal abuse from overseers. Then the plantation owners would sell the resulting crop to clothing and soft goods manufacturers. However, the cotton couldn't be sold or fashioned into anything until the seeds embedded in its fibers were removed. This was yet another thing accomplished through slave labor, and at the time, it could only be done by hand. Hands that were often left cracked and bloodied from the task by day's end. Even working from sunrise to sunset, with the overseer's whips cracking overhead, the average slave could only filter 1 pound of cotton a day. But drop that same pound of cotton into Whitney's machine, and the seeds would be removed in minutes. This launched the American cotton industry into the industrial age overnight. 2 slaves working a gin could now filter 50 pounds of cotton a day, and as use of the device became more widespread, an economic explosion took place. Because as production capacities grew, so did the demand. And just as the cotton gin arrived, advances in textile manufacturing meant factories in the UK needed more cotton. And guess where they got it from? As the southern cotton economy boomed, so did the institution of slavery. Actually, before Whitney's gin was introduced, many in the North thought slavery would eventually be phased out, as it had been proven to no longer be just an issue of morality, but also an unsustainable business model. Cotton, you see, had been about as profitable as tobacco and sugar, which is to say, not really at all, because turns out, the cost of maintaining slaves was in fact greater than the profit from the crops they could produce. But Whitney's invention changed all that. Thanks to the cotton gin, the U.S. southern states would increase their output from 3,000 bales in 1790 to more than 3.8 million by 1860, accounting for nearly 3/4 of the world's cotton. And if you're thinking that at least with the machine the slaves might have had it easier, that wasn't the case. Because as slaves became more valuable to cotton plantations, tobacco farmers tried to recoup their losses by selling off their slaves to King Cotton, which in many cases meant irreversibly breaking up entire families. By contrast, plantation owners were keeping their families in even grander houses. Opulent mansions that, mind you, were also built with uncompensated slave labor. In fact, thanks to all their profits from slave labor, half of the millionaires in the United States lived in Natchez, Mississippi, with one man owning nearly 40,000 acres of land. That's 3 times the size of Manhattan. And despite the growing number of abolitionists pushing to end slavery, these so-called Southern gentlemen were not going to give up their ill-gotten wealth without a fight. If anything, the existence of the cotton gin and its ability to satisfy the growing demand compelled them to double down. And not just on the human devastation, mind you, but on the environmental devastation as well. Mass cotton cultivation led to overharvesting, which irreparably damaged the once fertile soil. And when that soil began to show signs of faltering, the plantation owners decided to push the cotton industry and slavery further west. Meanwhile, as the cotton barons were getting even more wealthy, one person who didn't get rich was Eli Whitney. You see, while Whitney thought he would replace the failing institution of slavery with the cotton gin, this wasn't exactly out of the goodness of his heart. He was also in it for the money. But the money wouldn't come. Mostly because, while he and his team thought they were going to corner the market with the invention, their designs were ruthlessly pirated and duplicated. Imagine that. The same people who had no qualms about keeping human beings in bondage, stealing an invention. Now, of course, Whitney didn't take that lying down. In fact, he practically bankrupted himself filing lawsuits. And in the end, 3 states awarded him an accumulative reward of $90,000, a far cry from the millions King Cotton had earned. Disillusioned, Whitney returned to Connecticut, where in 1798, he parlayed his practical knowledge into a government contract to produce 10,000 muskets in 2 years. He'd complete the project in 10. Though, just an aside on that, though late in delivering the muskets, Whitney did pioneer the concept of interchangeable parts and standardization of mass production, which was a major development in American industrialization. He'd end up respected for that, if nothing else. Then, in 1825, Whitney passed away from prostate cancer, missing the tragedy his invention would inadvertently fuel. Because as the southern states reaped massive wealth from cotton crops, many of the plantation owners also took high-ranking positions in local government. They fought tooth and nail to protect their cotton profits with legislation, and even managed to prevent Abraham Lincoln from appearing on the southern state ballots when he ran for president in 1860. And when Lincoln was still elected as the 16th president of the United States without a single southern vote, the plantation elite used their political influence to drag each state into secession from the Union, despite the fact that most of the white citizens were not members of the planter aristocracy that now controlled their government. Unfortunately, Southerners were still drawn to support the secession and the impending Civil War, simply from the stance of not letting the North tell them what to do, or the promise that they too might one day own slaves. You know that old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Well, the story of the cotton gin kinda fits that adage to a T. True, there's no way of knowing how things would have played out had it not been invented, or even if it had taken another decade to come about. But the definitive lesson here is that progress for some often translates to a step back for others, especially in a free market scenario where profits and not justice are the priority. And as discussions over racial and economic disparity continue, it's easy to draw parallels between the cotton gin and our current era. How many times have we been sold a technology that's supposed to level the playing field or make everyone's lives easier? And how many times have we later learned that that same technology has terrible consequences for workers, consumers, or the environment? So the story of the cotton gin should remind us that technology itself can't deliver justice and equality. That work is still up to all of us. You know, one of the main reasons we're able to make episodes of Extra History like the one you just watched is thanks to the generosity of all of our fantastic patrons over on Patreon. Now, if you'd like to join our Patreon community, not only will you be helping us create the content you love, but you'll also have cool options, like suggesting and voting on Extra History topics, viewing all of our shows early, accessing our lovely official Discord, snagging some exclusive 4K wallpapers and never-before-seen digital posters, and tons more. Just take a look at the tiers and see what tickles your fancy. But no matter if you want to help forge the future of Extra History, join an awesome community, or are just passionate about learning, please consider supporting our channel by clicking the card right up here. And if you do, you'll be joining the awesome ranks of Ahmed Ziad Turk, Alicia Bramble, Casey Mustia, Dominic Valenciana, Joseph Blame, Kyle Murgatroyd, and O'Reels1, who are all fantastic legendary patrons.